This is going to be a long story with a slow build, with other details added for context, so be ready for that. There will be passing, vague references to child abuse, again for context. This being said, I have a deep-seated fear of windows. I've had thick curtains and blinds on all my windows which are closed completely, day or night. I currently live on the second floor, since I also hate being on the ground floor. And even now I can't handle even the tightest gap in the window. I'm a 27-year-old dude, but I have a pretty hefty PTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and bipolar disorder, both of which involve many fears and anxieties, including this. I could tell you stories about many of my fears, but this is a story of why I'm afraid of windows. I couldn't tell you the exact year that this happened, but it would have been in the late 90s when I was a young boy, maybe 5 or 6. My parents were still together and we lived in a bungalow just a stone's throw away from Detroit. Literally, we lived right on the border. If you don't know, a bungalow is a small 2-story house where the second floor is basically just a single room, my dad's bedroom. I slept on the ground floor, right next to the side entrance. All bungalows have a front entrance and a side entrance, the latter of which is generally used more since it's right along the driveway. This being the case, it was out of view and had a car sitting there, which could further obscure the potential burglar. We had several break-ins where I lived. Luckily, my parents were able to afford an alarm system, which triggered anytime someone tried to break in through the window. This happened 3 times I can remember, including this occasion. My bed was situated in the corner of the room, which was also the corner of the house. Directly in front of me and to the left was a window facing the backyard, which I couldn't see out of unless I got out of bed. To my right and slightly behind was a window right next to the side door. Both times the break-ins occurred previously, it had happened during the day when no one was home. This time was obviously different. Being that I have experienced a lot of intense bullying and an abusive father, I was a pretty scared little kid, and this pushed me over the edge. I say this just to help portray how terrifying this was for me. Anyway, here's what happened. I was maybe 5 or 6, it was late at night and I was awake. I never could get to sleep, and it was dead quiet. Then I heard it, a jiggle. The sound of the door handle being jiggled. I at first thought maybe one of my parents was up, but I realized I heard it from both inside the house and from outside, from the window. I froze. I knew it had to be one of my parents, it just had to be. Please let it be one of them, I thought. I listened carefully and could hear someone fidgeting with the lock, scuffling around anxiously, mumbling to themselves. I knew what was happening, but I remember my mom assuring that this sort of thing only happens during the day when no one was home, so I didn't need to worry. Well, now we were home, and I was seemingly the only one awake, so now I needed to worry. I thought about yelling, but I knew that they were right outside my window, and my blinds were open. I realized this, and looked at the light from the window on the wall across from me. Remember, I couldn't see the window itself, but I could see its outline. I saw a shadow, the outline of a head, followed by hands, like that thing people do when they're trying to look in a window. I was in the corner, and hoped he couldn't see me, but just to be safe I closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep. I still believed in God, so I laid there and prayed that he would go away and leave us alone, but he didn't. I lay there for what seems like an eternity, but it was probably just a minute or 2. I opened my eyes. I looked at the shadow on the wall and only saw a square of the moonlight. I was relieved but still scared. I decided I would get up quietly and go tell my mom, who slept in the living room downstairs. I quickly sat up, took off the covers, and got up. That's when I saw him, really saw him. There's another window if you recall, which I couldn't see from my bed either, and it got less light coming from outside. So there wasn't really a shadow, but the blinds were open and I could see out, but only once I stood up to go to the door. I saw him in my peripheral vision. One half of me was screaming to not look and to just run. The other half refused to believe he was really there. When you're that young, you don't believe such things could really happen to you. But I had already lived with a monster, so I turned my head to face the window rather than run away. But I really wish I hadn't. His face was directly against the glass, almost frozen, like he was focusing, trying to see in. He was almost like a statue. Even then, I couldn't accept that it was real. I couldn't tell you how he looked, what color his hair was, what race he was. Hell, I don't even really know if it was a dude. The backyard was dark, but there was just enough light to see his outline and his eyes. I could see the whites of his eyes and a dark center seemingly peering directly into my soul. Although he didn't have his hands cupped and it was very dark, so I don't think he saw me. But maybe that's another lie I tell myself. Regardless, I could see him, nothing but a thin piece of glass between us. I pictured him breaking the glass and crawling in, grabbing me. I knew my parents wouldn't get up to get me in time, even with an alarm. Maybe this was an irrational thought, but try telling that to a small, scared boy who at the moment was too afraid to ask his dad for help and was too sad about a sick mom to even bother her, even under threat. I locked eyes with him for what felt like an eternity, but again, probably only for a few seconds. Then he eventually moved away from the window. I snapped out of it for a little bit, and I decided I needed to go wake up my mom. I got on the ground and started to crawl, but I was terrified. I loved Barney the dinosaur, and at the time I grabbed my favorite stuffed Barney from the bed and took him with me. I crawled to my door, which was barely ajar. My mom would leave it open with the hallway light on, but she'd often turn it off after she knew I was asleep to save on electricity. We had a security system, yes, but we were still not a financially stable family. We weren't even really a family, but I digress. Anyway, I carefully opened the door to the hallway, but I could hear it again, the jiggling. It went on for longer this time. I carefully made my way through the hallway, still hearing the sound of him trying to get inside. I got to the couch where my mom was sleeping and gently shook her awake. She asked me what was wrong, and I put my hand over her mouth, shushing her. At the same time, I whispered, "Mommy, there's someone trying to get in." She listened carefully, and she heard the handle jiggling too. We had guns in the house, but the problem is only my dad knew how to get them and use them. He wouldn't let my mom near them. They were upstairs with him and in the basement, and both of us were too scared of him, even then, to wake him up. Instead, she grabbed me, hid me under her blanket. She took out a knife she always kept under her pillow, still does this to the day. After laying there terrified for what felt like hours, suddenly, the loud piercing sound of the alarm filled the house. We then, just seconds later, heard loud, fevered footsteps. My mom gripped me and the knife tightly as we waited to see which monster's footsteps we heard. Was it the one from the outside, or was it the one that we already lived with? For once, we were happy that it was the latter. My dad was a massive dude, and this worked in our favor for once, and he came downstairs with a handgun he slept with. By the time he had got to the door, the man was gone. My dad caught a glimpse of him sprinting out down the street. So there you have it. That's what happened. That's where my fear of windows comes from. And even though it was 20 years ago, when it's nighttime and I'm feeling particularly on edge, I check my windows to make sure they're properly covered. As I do so, I remember what could be on the other side of that window. I remember those eyes, and I can still see them clearly as I did that night. Four years ago when I was 17, my best friend Hannah, also 17, came over to my house for the weekend. I believe that it was Saturday night when it happened. We stayed up late, ate some junk food, watched movies. It was around 1 a.m. when I decided to take a shower and head to bed. After our horror movie marathon, I was pretty paranoid, so I asked Hannah to sit in the bathroom with me while I showered. So she did just that. She sat on the toilet and played some music on her cell phone, and we talked about whatever was going on in our lives while I showered. Finally, after my 20-minute shower, I got out and grabbed a towel. Hannah was still sitting on the toilet, and she said my name, so I turned to face her. That's when I noticed some movement from the bathroom window above her head. The style of window slightly distorted it, but I immediately knew what I was looking at. A face, a man's face, smirking at me on the other side of the glass. The man ducked out of view, and I quickly faced away, wrapping my towel around me. I whispered to Hannah that there was a man looking through the window, and she laughed, thinking I was messing with her. She bravely stands up and, to her horror, becomes face to face with the creep, staring, smirking. We run out of the bathroom to wake up my parents, but the creepy dude was already gone by the time my dad got outside. Next day, my parents investigate outside the window. There was a cinder block underneath it that the man had been standing on, indicating that this probably wasn't the first time he peeped on me. Then there was something stuck between the block and the wall. A bottle of lotion. The window cling was useless. You could see everything inside of the bathroom clearly from the outside. We didn't know this at the time. I still can't shower without that window being covered up. When I was around 7 years old, my parents rented out our basement to a young couple, a man and a woman. Things went smoothly for the first couple of months, for the most part, other than the occasional loud partying here and there. They were nice enough, and would leave their door open, which was underneath the back porch, for my siblings and I, the youngest being 5 and oldest being 9, to wander in and out and use their basketballs, badminton rackets, etc. whenever they were home. They would let us come and go as we pleased, although we didn't do it that often, as our parents weren't very comfortable with the idea, of course. As time went on, they started to get a bit out of hand, throwing loud parties all hours of the night and disturbing the neighbors, sketchy people coming in and out, and my parents suspected that they were growing marijuana in the basement, as the house constantly smelled like weed all throughout. My parents did end up finding a plant being grown in the closet under a lamp and evicted them immediately. Marijuana was illegal at the time. A few years went by until a family member who works in corrections came over one day. They began talking to my mom about the former tenants and asked if they knew where they had ended up, and she said she didn't know. The family member told us that the man was brought into the facility that they worked at, who looked and sounded familiar, but they weren't able to place him. They suspected that the man may be our ex-tenant, who was actually being held on charges of sexual assault and murder, but they weren't sure if it was him or not. Eventually, my mom was able to confirm the identity of the man as being our ex-tenant. He was arrested for raping and murdering his ex-girlfriend with his father. My parents didn't tell us that until years later, but it was pretty wild news considering how many times he invited my siblings and I, without hesitation, into their basement whenever we were playing in the yard. I was home alone in my previous apartment. It was a not so great neighborhood. My apartment was on ground level, and my bedroom window faced a back alley. A dumpster sat less than 2 car lengths away, where homeless people often rummaged. Just before dawn one morning, I heard a tapping on my window. My back was to the window, and my eyes were now wide open. It was still dark outside. I sleep with my lamp on, and my worn-out vertical blinds were missing a few slats, causing a 6-inch gap, so I knew whoever or whatever the source of the tapping could see me laying in bed plain as day. The tapping was brief, maybe 5 or 6 taps, so I spent the next 5 or 6 seconds frozen, bizarrely trying to convince myself that it was something, anything else than a person watching me and tapping on my window, maybe an animal. Then came more tapping. Now I was faced with a terrible reality that someone had been watching me through the window in the dark for God knows how long, and he decided to tap on the window. Had one of the homeless people become aggressive during the dumpster dive? Something told me that nothing good could come from me turning around and looking at the window. If he got me to look at him, what then? Remember, my back was to the guy, so I slowly, rubbing my eyes and pretending that I was too groggy to hear him, I stood up and hazily made my way out of the bedroom, as though I was going to the restroom or something. Once I was out of sight, I ran to the phone to dial 911, considering whether to forget any embarrassment of being in my t-shirt and underwear and bowled out of my front door, which was out of sight of the intruder. I wasn't sure if I could outrun whoever was there, or whether anyone would help me if I couldn't. Before I could make that decision, I heard a loud pop of my window being pried open. I thought my heart would jump out of my chest. At the same time, I could hear my upstairs neighbor Mike descending his stairs. I opened my door a few inches and peek out and ask him for his help. Mike was a big guy, and I heard he was trained in martial arts of some sort. He didn't hesitate to respond, hustling to the back of the apartment to see what was going on. Within a few seconds, I heard rumbling and someone being thrown against the wall and into the bushes. A few minutes later, Mike came around to the front door, telling me not to worry about seeing this guy ever again. He had beaten him up pretty badly. I wanted to believe Mike that would-be intruder was maybe dumpster diving, but that he would hopefully never venture this way again. But according to Mike, it wasn't a homeless person. When the guy escaped, he ran to the front of the building, hopped into a red sports car, and sped off. My neighborhood wasn't a red sports car kind of place. The police later told me that the intruder was likely someone who'd seen me out somewhere and followed me home to find out where I lived. So Mr. Window Tapper, I still wonder what you would have done if you had gotten inside before Mike caught you. I wonder if you still follow me, and because of that, I often find myself wishing that Mike had put an end to you. If you found out where I now live, let's never meet. My dad's job requires him to go inside people's houses. He's been in 1,000 apartments and houses, so I asked him what the weirdest or creepiest thing he had ever experienced. My dad arrived early to an apartment complex around 7 a.m. because he had to go through every apartment, doing some maintenance starting from the basement. He entered a laundry room located in the basement, where a man, around 50-ish, wearing a nice white shirt with a tie, suit pants, but no shoes, green tarp in his hands. He thought it was kind of weird, but just ignored it, since it was none of his business. Later that day, he left to take a break at a local coffee shop, and when he came back to work, there were police cars surrounding the area. Out of curiosity, he asked one of the officers what was going on, and it turns out a homicide was committed. My dad then asked if what he saw was related to the crime, and oh, it was. After the police interrogation, they told him that the man without the shoes stabbed his mother to death in his bathtub, wrapped her in a tarp, and drug her outside. The police caught him dragging his mother into the backyard. Of course, they didn't let my dad do his job in the murderer's apartment until after a proper investigation. A while goes by and my dad gets to go and finish what he was doing. He felt really uncomfortable doing plumbing and other maintenance in that house where someone had just got brutally murdered, especially in the bathroom where the bathtub was full of dry blood. A few years back when I was 19, I had just gotten my first apartment in the basement of an apartment complex. That might sound odd, but a friend's mother talked to the apartment's landlord into finding me a cheap place to live. This was Denver, so it wasn't cheap for a one-bedroom apartment. The basement apartment was a studio located on the base of a flight of stairs. It was the only apartment at the bottom of these stairs, between the apartment's boiler room and laundry area, and even further down a brick hallway with a screen door and a landing before you finally got to my apartment door. The first few months living there was fine. There was a smoking area up the flight of stairs that led to my apartment. One day I was up there having a cigarette when a Native American man sat next to me and also started smoking. He was a resident in the apartment. His name was John. John seemed mostly normal, maybe a little bit lonely, but nothing unnerving. He said he lived alone and that he was an artist. We chatted until my cigarette was through. I said goodbye to John and went back downstairs. I would see John occasionally smoking as I was going to or coming back from work. He always said hi and never gave off any red flags, which makes this even more creepy. One night when I was asleep, I woke up to the sound of the doorknob to my apartment jiggling. It was like someone was frantically trying to break the lock. I got out of bed immediately, grabbed a knife from the kitchen. If this had been a normal room, someone would have heard the doorknob rattling. But my apartment was so secluded. I stood right next to the door that was jiggling and said, "Hello, who's there?" No one answered. I looked through the peephole, but it was too dark to see. I said in a loud, confident voice, "If you come in here, I will kill you." And I was serious about that too. Back then I was pretty fearless and in not a great mental state. The jiggling immediately stopped. Whoever it was booked it back through the screen door, down the hallway, and up the dark flight of stairs. I don't know if they thought I was asleep until then or what, but I think I scared them. I could see the dark outline go by the stairs through the peephole, but could not make out the person's features. I made a mistake that night when I decided not to call the cops. I felt like it would be a hassle, and that it was probably just a drunk person causing mischief. My heart was pounding from the adrenaline, but I felt confident I could take care of myself, and mostly put the incident out of mind. About a week later, late at night, around 2 a.m., I woke up and realized that the door to my apartment was wide open. I was in shock and couldn't really process what I was looking at. I walked towards the door, wondering how someone could have came in and just left, making no sounds. I remember my heart was beating furiously, and it was difficult to breathe. Every footstep felt like I was walking further into a fatal danger zone. I examined the door, and the doorknob had been completely removed. I don't know how he broke the doorknob without waking me up. Maybe he used a knife to carve it out. Maybe it wasn't fastened securely in the first place and just popped off, but it was pretty sturdy when he jiggled it the first time. I'm a fairly light sleeper, and I just don't understand how he could have done that. It still bothers me to this day. There was a clean hole where the doorknob was, and the doorknob was gone. I never found it. The kitchen knife that I threatened an intruder with the week before was laying on the ground next to my bed. Maybe I got up and put it next to me in my sleep. I don't know. It's a mystery to me, and that's one of the reasons why this occurrence still bothers me so much. I just can't figure it out. This person had been in my room, possibly watching me sleep, and they just left without doing anything. I'm lucky, I guess, but I'll never really know why. I bought a deadbolt for the door, and the doorknob was replaced. Since people will probably ask, I didn't call the cops. Like I said, I was in a bad mental state and didn't really have a lot of energy to care about myself, but that's besides the point. I was really on edge for the next few weeks, but nothing happened again. Until a few weeks later, when the guy tried to break in broad daylight. He was doing his doorknob jiggling routine again, and I saw, this time, it was John, completely drunk. I know because I yelled at him. He scurried drunkenly back up the stairs like he did the first time. He apparently was known for having a drinking problem. After that time, the entire complex knew what he had done, and the owner of the building urged me to press charges, and, I believe, evicted John. I didn't press charges, however, and I moved shortly after. To set the tone, I always hated the town I lived in. I moved there alone when I was 18 for college and quickly regretted it. It was a decent-sized town, but full of non-decent people. Nearly every gas station was robbed frequently. There were shootings in broad daylight, robberies, you name it. Well, for the first 3 years I lived with a roommate on a side town that wasn't awful, but it was sketchy. So when I started making decent enough money, I moved out on my own. The house was teeny, maybe 500 square feet if that. Super old and poorly built. It was just me living there, so I didn't mind how small it was. But what originally sold me was that it was in the middle of nowhere. It was surrounded by a bunch of fields, some wooded areas, and only a few houses nearby. Considering I hated being in town due to the constant paranoia of getting mugged or shot, I loved the idea of living out there. So at the beginning of July, I moved in. Everything seemed super swell, minus not being able to get good internet. A month goes by and everything is still swell to me, and I decided to get a dog to keep me company. He also loved the place, and spent long amounts of time lounging in the yard, trying to convince the nearest neighbor to walk over and pet him. Important later. Roughly 2 months of living there, I started to notice things out of place. Something to note is that an old roommate of mine was using the spare room for storage until he got moved himself, so he had a key but was never there. He just kind of popped in every other week to grab something and usually let me know beforehand. I'd come home to my kitchen chair being pulled away from my table, or a bowl in the sink, things like that. They were such small things that I wrote it off as my ex-roommate swinging by, or just stuff that I was forgetting. But then, my dog developed this crazy bad separation anxiety. Up until now, he didn't care when I left. He just lay on the couch and chew on his toys. He never barked, never did anything weird. However, all of a sudden he began acting really awful every time I tried to leave. He would literally cram his body through the door as I was closing it, screaming and barking, and wouldn't stop until I came back in the house. He didn't want me to leave him there alone, at all. I couldn't afford a kennel for him yet, so I decided one day to put a movie on while I was out, thinking maybe the sounds of people might keep him calm. I only had to finish one task at work, and knew I'd be home early, so I put a copy of Hamlet. I know, boring, but I chose it because the copy I have is 5 hours long, and I knew it would be playing when I came back. Fast forward 3 hours, long before Hamlet should have been over. But when I walked into the door, not only was the movie not playing, but the Xbox and TV were completely off. I immediately called my roommate and asked if he had been over, and he wasn't even in town. I explained the TV situation to him, and he shrugged it off, as the TV powering sometimes shuts off when it idles for a while. Even if that was true, there were several reasons I know this isn't the case. It wasn't idling. A 5-hour movie was supposed to be playing. Even if it had shut off, my Xbox wouldn't have. I had left it on by accident for weeks when I was out of town once, and it was still on when I came home, but it was completely powered down this time. The weirdest thing was none of my stuff was missing, and the door was locked when I entered. I eventually convinced myself that it was something weird with my Xbox or whatever, and shrugged it off. This was until my dog started acting weirder. Remember when I mentioned that I used to play with a neighbor? Well, all of a sudden, if she walked by the house while he was out, he'd start yelping and running at me away from her. This was incredibly weird of him and made me incredibly cautious of her. I put some cheap alarms on my door, the kind that go off when the door is open, and slept with my pistol handy. The second night that the alarms were on my doors, I was woken up by one of the back doors going off. I flew out of bed with my pistol, trying to convince myself that I was about to shoot an intruder, but once I got to the door, it was shut and there was no one there. The alarm had been knocked all the way across the room. The door would have had to have been opened for it to be chucked like that. It couldn't have fallen off and landed there. Something else was weird. The door was locked, but not the way I had locked it. I had always locked the knob and the deadbolt, but upon checking my lock, only the doorknob was locked. The police couldn't do much, as I had no witnesses, no lead, and they didn't have much to go on. Needless to say, I changed my locks. I didn't have any noticeable problems after that, but later, I found out that the close neighbor that my dog hated previously lived in the house I was renting, and the locks had never been changed. I had no way to prove my theory, but it's pretty obvious that she had a key and was coming and going as she pleased. Why though, I can't figure out. Nothing of mine was missing. The most unsettling part for me was, she had tried to come in at night until the alarm went off. How many times has she been in my house at night while I was asleep? This happened a few years ago, while me and my brother were still both living at home. There had been a rash of break-ins in my area in the weeks leading up to it, and several of my neighbors had been broken into. My mom had been at work all day. It was around 8:30, the time she normally arrived back. I was in the kitchen, my brother was in the living room on an exercise machine. I heard the familiar sound of the front door opening, then closing, and assumed my mom was back. I waited in the kitchen for the door from the hall to open and for her to call out. Neither happened. There were no familiar sounds. When a minute went by, I went out to check and found that no one was there and her car was not in the driveway. I assumed that my mom had arrived home and then immediately gone back out for some reason. This had happened before. My brother, who also heard the sound, thought the same thing. Over the next half hour, I found myself thinking, imagine if it turns out that it wasn't her and an intruder had literally been meters away from me on the other side of the hall door. Fast forward to 9 p.m. My mom arrives home, and of course, it hadn't been her the first time. all three of us collectively freaked out when we realized that while my brother and I had heard the door open and close, indicating that someone had entered the house, we hadn't heard them leave. A search of the house revealed that we were panicking over nothing. No one was there. Our theory is that the intruder opened the door and maybe stepped in halfway, heard my brother on the exercise machine, and left once he realized that the house wasn't empty. We filed a police report and got a locksmith in, who told us that the front door had been installed back in my grandparents' day and was hilariously ineffective, and anyone with the slightest burglary experience could waltz into the house whenever they wanted. Apparently, you could almost open this thing without tools. That's how easy it was. Needless to say, we got all of the exterior doors, locks changed, bought an alarm system, and basically sealed it up like Fort Knox. The creepiest element of this became clear only in hindsight. See, the days immediately prior to the break-in, there had been a number of odd incidents. I thought I heard someone trying the back door handle late at night, and our dog freaked out for no apparent reason. We had also found a cigarette butt on our front doorstep, and none of us smoked. We think the house had been cased. Whoever did it might have missed me and my brother's presence and concluded that the house's only occupant was a single woman who worked long hours. To this day, I'm glad I didn't open the hall door and meet them face to face. About 2 years ago, I was long distance dating a guy who was my first love. He loved me too, but unfortunately, due to the long distance and his addiction problems, we had to break it off. As most people act when their first relationship or love ends, they enter weeks of depression or denial. I had trouble sleeping for at least a month. This caused me to be late to work almost every day, and as a result, I received a warning that if I didn't fix my attendance issue, then I would be let go. I immediately forced myself to try to occupy my time with my freelance illustrations, and really attempted to go to bed early. The first couple of days it was rough, but I kept at it. The first night that I remember getting work done and sleeping on time was the night it happened. Quick backstory, my roommate and I lived in a house, separated into 2 living spaces. One of our friends rented the upstairs. I figured I should only mention this because our windows, for example, were very accessible and unfortunately didn't have locks. We also had a backyard that was fenced off, but like the windows, the fence door was also lock-free. Now to what happened. I was asleep, but due to being a light sleeper and being incredibly heartbroken, I easily awoke to lights coming through the blinds of my bedroom window. Luckily, my bed was adjacent to the window, so they didn't see me. I was still a little foggy from being sleep deprived and also from the melatonin, but forced myself to wake up when whispering voices came from the people holding the flashlights. There were at least 3 of them. It was such a blur that I could only really remember that detail. They were wearing black and began to move to the fence of our backyard. I immediately began to feel so emotional at being woken up, and my body went into autopilot. I grabbed my phone and box cutter. I worked at Trader Joe's, and we used one of those every day. I then woke up my roommate. I dialed 911 and handed him the phone, and told him to tell the operator that people were trying to break in. My amazing roommate seemed to understand immediately, despite being shaken awake. I pounded my way to the kitchen, where we had a huge window looking into our backyard. My adrenaline pumped as I saw a stranger make his way through the fence, their flashlights bobbing around. It was that moment that triggered me into a fit of tears. Not the cute one-drop tears on your cheeks, but the type where a river of tears come down your face, making it difficult to see. I mean, the boyfriend who I loved left me. I haven't been able to sleep. The job was threatening to fire me, and now these assholes woke me up and were trying to take what little I had. They began to look through the window of the back shed, which like an idiot we hadn't attached a padlock to. Inside was a bike that my dad had bought for me, and the bikes of my friends who lived upstairs, and an old TV. One of the intruders made their way to our back door. when in a fit of tears and anger, I beat him to it. I flicked our kitchen light on and swung the door open. The stranger was right in front of me and jumped backwards. I mean, to be fair, I was holding an incredibly sharp, extended box cutter while crying really badly. I started yelling at them about being woken up and being depressed, and how dare they try to rob someone who was barely keeping it together. I was essentially yelling at no one after a couple of seconds, because they booked it as soon as I started to confront them. The police came, took our statements, and asked for a description, and said that they would look around. They never found anyone, probably because I never followed the strangers to see which way they had gotten to our place. If so, I could have got their license plate or something. It didn't occur to me afterwards that I should have told them that the police were coming, or worry that they might have hurt me, or more importantly, my roommate. Looking back, I feel really bad for risking our lives like that. I don't really know what came over me, but I was holding so much sadness and anger, and these people caused me to let it out. Anyway, that's what happened. I've learned a lot since then, like having our landlords install locks for our windows, and seeing a therapist. It may have worked out for me, but to anyone reading this, please don't be as stupid as me, especially when other lives are at stake. I should have just waited inside for the police, or yelled at them through the window, but I didn't. So yeah, if the people who tried to break into my home are reading this, I hope I never encounter you again, and I assume the feeling is mutual. I had been living on my own with my boyfriend, Ashton, for almost 2 years now. I recently had a break-in while I was home, about a week ago. It was early in the morning, about 3 a.m., nighttime for most of you. My boyfriend works a night shift, so he wasn't home at the time that this happened. I was on my phone when I thought I heard someone coming up the stairs from outside. I was just about to close my eyes to go to sleep when I heard my front door being opened. I thought it was my boyfriend, so I called out his name, Ashton, to realize that this was a big mistake. Now, my house is a one-bedroom apartment, so there isn't really anywhere to hide, especially when I'm stuck in my room. My bedroom door doesn't have a doorknob on it because it broke, so it's kind of tricky for someone to get in. The only place I had to hide was behind my bed, behind a small wall that was still pretty visible. I grabbed a wood knife my boyfriend has on his side of the dresser and hid. I could hear someone trying to get into my bedroom. It was one of the most intense things that had ever happened in my life. I held my breath and was ready to start screaming and kicking and scaring whoever it was with the knife as much as I could so that my downstairs neighbors would hear me and would come upstairs or call the police. The door swung open and I saw a tall, thin man with a mask over his head and a black hoodie. He saw me and headed for me, but I tried to scream and tried to kick him in his knees. I ended up kicking him in the nuts, and he fell down immediately. He stood back up and ran to the front door. As soon as I saw the front door opened, and it was my boyfriend getting dropped off from his friend at work, I pushed him out of the house and immediately told him what was going on. And he told me to run downstairs to his buddy's car and to tell him what was going on and stay in the car with him. He took the knife from me and stayed in the front room. I ran outside to Josh's car and told him everything. He stayed in the parking lot and he called the police. But then we heard gunshots. Thank God my boyfriend didn't get shot, but the bullets went right into the door and nearly hit my boyfriend in the leg. If it wasn't for my boyfriend and his friend to come home early that night, I think I would have been dead. Three years ago, when I was 17, I went to Target to get my grandmother something. This Target was about 30 minutes from my house, and there was one closer to where I lived, but this one was closest to my grandma's. I went in and was doing my shopping, and I noticed a man who was about 35 to 40 following me around the store. I blew it off, thinking maybe he was getting similar stuff. As I checked out, I didn't see him anymore, so I figured all was well. When I got back into my car and was loading all my groceries, I heard something drop behind me. I looked back to see the same man, standing maybe 4 feet behind me, staring me down with something in his hand. I panicked and got into my car immediately and locked the doors. I decided to drive straight home and just head back to my grandmother's later. As I was leaving the parking lot, I took note of all the cars behind me. I started heading home and called my mom to tell her what just happened, and then hung up. I got on the interstate after about 10 minutes, and I noticed every time I had changed lanes, the van behind me changed lanes too. As I got off the interstate and grew closer and closer to my house, I took several left turns to see if the van would follow, and it did. At this point, I called my mom again and told her I was being followed. She told me to keep driving until her and my dad could meet me somewhere, and not to come home. At this point, I was 5 minutes from my house. They met me at a grocery store parking lot and told me to park my car. I started to get out, and as soon as I stepped outside of my car, the man parked and emerged from his van quickly with a rag in his hand. I ran to my mom's car and we called the police. My dad started driving after the van, but the man had noticed that I had called for help and had sped off. The police never found his van. That was one of the scariest encounters of my life. When I lived in a city, going to Target was a daily thing. I had to go find some pants to wear for a party, so I went to Target to see what they had and if I could find anything that I liked. I noticed a guy had walked in behind me, and every time I turned around, he just happened to be there. I thought it was just a coincidence, and maybe he was into the same stuff as me, since we ended up being in the same aisles at some point. I had walked over to the makeup to look for some new foundation, because mine was gone, and I just happened to turn around and he was standing right there, in front of the NYX stuff. So at that point, I knew something was up. He wasn't holding anything. He was just standing around, trying not to make eye contact with me every time I looked at him. I walked out and to the checkout line because I wasn't feeling comfortable anymore. I had a gut feeling that if I stayed in the store, something would end up happening. He followed me over to the checkout line, and nothing was in his hands, so he had nothing to pay for. He just stood there, looking around every time I looked at him. He was acting like I couldn't see him, or even feel him looking at me, like he was trying to stare into my soul. I paid and grabbed my stuff and was gonna walk out the door, but I didn't want him to follow me out to my car, so instead, I walked to the other end of the store to go to the bathroom. He didn't follow me to begin with, but when I walked out of the bathroom, he was standing right there in the men's section, looking at underwears and socks. Again, not holding a single thing, but just watching me. So I walked around some more, just to see if he would follow me again, and he did. I found the store manager and pulled him aside. I whispered to him that an older man had been following me around the store the whole time I had been in there, and that I didn't feel safe enough to walk to my car alone, so I had just been walking around trying to lose him. The manager told me that people had been caught trying to kidnap people for sex trafficking, and that they had a prior incident a couple months ago. He told me that I was smart to stay in the store. He called the police, but the guy had left the store before he showed up. If you ever have a gut feeling, please listen to it. That day could have ended up a lot worse for me.
When I was younger, my mother would leave me home with my older brothers. As soon as she would leave the house, they would pull out a hidden Ouija board and play around with it. Of course, I wasn't allowed to be part of the game. I was around 6 or 7 and they were in their late teens. I can so vividly remember those memories. Mother would leave and the boys went into the bedroom off the kitchen where the board was hidden. They would then close the door behind them, and I was left watching cartoons by myself in the living room. The bedroom door had a gap under it though, about 1.5 inches, and I would sometimes quietly lay on the floor and watch them play through the gap. I can remember them making contact with the spirit one night, and then they asked it its name, to which it replied, Tobias. Each time they played after that, it always seemed to be Tobias reaching out. For about a week, they conversed with the spirit, and nothing out of the ordinary seemed to come of it. However, one night, as I was watching them play, the board started talking about me. My brothers would always write down the things being communicated and read them out loud, which made it easier for me to eavesdrop on them. As I lay there on the kitchen floor, looking under the door, the game became more active and my brother started writing. I then saw both of them make eye contact and looked at each other, confused. My older brother looked around and said, "It says we're being watched." As they looked around the room, I snuck back to the couch to watch my cartoons. They opened the door and then checked on me, and then went back to the room. I crept back over and continued watching them. This time, the board addressed me using my name. I recall my brother saying, "It says that Billy needs to go away." I could feel the blood leave my face. I knew my brothers hadn't seen me watching. I then got up and pretended to be sleeping on the couch, and eventually I just fell asleep there. I was awakened in the middle of the night by a strange sound, kind of like the sound a cat makes in its throat when it's mad. I then sat up and wiped the sleep from my eyes. I sat there in the dark for a moment, and it seemed so quiet in the house. I was about to get up and go to the bathroom, but then I felt like I couldn't stand up, almost like something was pushing down my shoulders. Suddenly, it was like I was in a wind tunnel. I remember the curtains were whirling around, and it felt like they filled the entire room. I felt so dizzy, and then it just stopped. I don't remember going to sleep at all, but I woke up on the same couch and it was finally daylight. I never spoke about this to anyone, but the story doesn't end there. My brothers continued to mess around with the board, to which I was no longer wanting to be around. It got to the point that weird things were happening to them too. They would talk about it amongst themselves, and I would play oblivious to it all. One night, my brothers walked out of the bedroom with a rolled-up sheet and scissors. They told me they would be right back and then walked out the door. I later learned the next morning that the board had said something that really frightened them. They took it down the road to the old iron bridge near the house to cut it up and throw it over. We were all sitting in the kitchen eating breakfast when we suddenly heard the sound of a loud crash outside. We ran out the door to see that a car had nearly driven off the bridge. My brothers were sure that it was because of the Ouija board, which they thought they had disposed of the night before. The person who wrecked the car happened to be a person my brother went to school with. He then told my brother that he had gotten in the crash because, when he was driving over the bridge, a demon-like figure appeared next to him in the car. He later found a piece of the board in his car, and nobody knows how it got there. This all happened to me between the ages of 2 and 9 years old. I lived in a huge apartment, about twice the size of the actual house I live in, maybe even a bit bigger. It had a fireplace that we never used in the living room. It had a living room, a kitchen, a big bedroom, a hallway, a small bedroom, bathroom, and inside the big bedroom was a tiny closet that led to a pretty big boiler room inside the walls. We usually used it for storage of holiday decorations and stuff. For some reason, I was deathly afraid of sleeping in my own room, which I was totally fine with playing in during the morning, so I ended up always sleeping in my dad's bed. His bed was much larger and definitely more comfortable. I slept in his bed till I was around 7 years old, to which I still refused to sleep in my room, so I then settled for the living room couch at the time. But before that all happened, when I was about 5 or so, it was super common for me to sleepwalk or sleep talk. It was a nightly occurrence, and my dad didn't think it was weird at all. He didn't even think it was weird when I would say stuff like, "Dad, I want you to meet my new friends." I would also sleepwalk in and out of the room constantly. I never even remembered saying any of this stuff, but he would casually tell me about it the next day, and it felt really weird to me, but I couldn't figure out why. I've always been the last person to go to sleep, no matter what age I was. I would always have this reoccurring nightmare. Now, I don't think I was asleep, but I didn't know anything about spirits or anything like that, and in the nightmare, I would be laying with my dad. He would be asleep, and there would be a shadow in the corner of the room, standing by the boiler room door. It definitely wasn't a reflection of anything in the room, because there wasn't much in there to begin with. Just a bed, dresser, and a computer desk and chair. Nothing in there could make a shape of a human-looking shadow. I would try to not move, and hoped that, if it attacks me, my dad would wake up. One night, I didn't fall asleep, and I'm sure of it to this day, that I was hearing a person in the living room, even though we lived alone and my dad was asleep next to me, snoring as usual. So, I went to investigate, and by the fireplace, there was a transparent figure of a chubby man with a mustache. He was yelling, but not in English. At this time, I thought it was Spanish because I didn't know about any other languages existing at the time. But now that I think of it, it was probably Latin. The same chubby man cornered me and started yelling in my face. I began to cry and duck under the coffee table in hopes that he couldn't lift it. Then the room went silent for like 2 minutes. I'm still too scared to come up because I think that he's still there. Then the coffee table starts lifting up. I then realized that it's my dad, and that the spirit was gone. He told me I was having a nightmare, probably sleepwalking, but I've never even heard of a ghost before, and I've never heard another language. I knew I wasn't asleep, and tried to defend myself, but he saw absolutely nothing weird the whole time, and shrugged it off. When I was around 12 or about 13 years old, I was staying at my dad's for the weekend. We watched movies and ate junk food, a usual occurrence when I got to see him. My brother was usually with us, but he was staying with a friend that night. He then decides it was time to go to bed. I went about my usual routine, getting ready for bed, laid down, and tried to get some sleep. I couldn't sleep this night for some reason. I just had a general feeling of uneasiness. My bed used to be vertical to the door, with my feet closest to the door. When I was a kid, I always used to sleep with my door open. I guess it gave me some sort of comfort, being able to see half of the entrance to my dad's door, knowing that he wasn't too far away from me. Anyways, as I said, I had a really hard time trying to fall asleep. Frustrated, I lay there, staring at my ceiling for a moment, and felt as if someone was watching me. I shifted my eyes to the doorway, and a pitch-black figure was standing in my doorway. Its head was almost touching the top of the frame. I've never had an issue with sleep paralysis, and have never had it since then, but in this moment, I couldn't move. All I could do was look, as this tall figure stood there, staring at me. Tears began to flow down my cheeks, and my heart felt as if it was about to burst from my chest. I managed to barely whisper, "Dad," and it turned its head sideways at me, as if it was confused. I began hyperventilating intensely, which must have woken up my dad, because he came running into my room, and as he came through the door, the figure quickly dissolved, as if a breeze came by and it went away with it. My dad held me in his arms as I cried. I slept in his room that night, and for the rest of my stay there till I went back to my mom's. This event shook me to my core, and to this day, I cannot and will not sleep with an open door. I still have a deep feeling of fear and almost want to cry when I picture that thing and remember that night. I've shared this story with most of my friends and none of them believe me. And that's fine. My scary story begins when I was around 10 years old. This happened in early June, which would be where my insomnia first started. I usually slept on my couch since I could never sleep in my bed. I fell asleep faster this night than any other. I typically don't go to bed until around 1 in the morning, but I fell asleep at around 11 p.m. this night. I began having a dream where I was walking down an empty, foggy street at night, only lit up by dim streetlights. I was walking along and saw a sweet older woman sitting in a rocking chair. Because I was very close with some of the older women in my family, I had a feeling of trust and immediately walked onto her porch. She looked up at me and smiled. I could not hear myself, but I believe I said hello because she responded to me, but I can't quite remember how she responded. But what I do remember was that she said, "Whatever you do, don't look at her. Do not look at the woman in the black dress." I stepped back, frightened. My eyes were then caught by a darkness. There was a streetlight unlit, and somebody was standing under it. Except something was off. I couldn't take my eyes off of them. It was a woman standing at about 6 feet. She had black hair, and her skin was pale. It wasn't until only seconds I realized why she felt off. Her arms were longer than normal, her legs were lanky, and her knees were backwards. She was almost standing how a ballerina stands with their feet together, pointed outward. She had a black dress torn apart at the bottom, and her face was horribly distorted. That's when it happened. She looked up at me, and suddenly, the street went dark. She then appeared from the shadows and grabbed me. I was then forced to awake, and there she was, right above me. I remembered what the old lady told me, and I closed my eyes tight. I could feel the woman pushing on my chest. I could feel her nails digging into me. I could hardly breathe. Only seconds had gone by, but it felt like minutes until I could open my eyes again. She was gone, and I began to cry. I ran upstairs, screaming for my parents. "The lady in the black dress got me! The lady in the black dress got me!" It freaked my dad right out, and my parents had to stay up with me all night. I didn't sleep for 5 days, until I finally passed out and slept for about 36 hours. Recently, my mother told me it was about 3:30 a.m. when I came screaming for them. It wasn't until lately that I found the courage to share this because I was so scared that she would return, but now that I'm older, I'm not afraid anymore. I've ruled it off as nothing more than sleep paralysis because it wasn't the first and last time I've had an experience like this. This one just felt a lot more real because I've never had anything be physical. It was usually just a figure in the corner or shadows melding and moving to play tricks on me. To this day, I think about that night and get a chill down my spine. Even though I'm writing this, I can almost feel her nails in my chest again. I haven't seen her since that night, but some nights, I fear she may return to finish me off. I've been a nurse for almost 5 years, and you can ask any nurse about this. Whether you're an ICU or rehabilitation nurse, for some reason, on every full moon, the hospital is in chaos. Some say it's the pull of the mystical lunar energy or whatever, but it's a known scientific fact that the moon has an effect on us. I'm sure you noticed this yourself. Perhaps you notice an increase of energy and can't fall asleep. And it's true. Many people are sleepless during the full moon, and it's one of the many reasons that they can be our busiest nights. On the night this story happened, I was relatively new and started as a rehab nurse. I had been warned by my peers that I better be ready for tonight as it was a full moon. I shrugged it off and told them that I wouldn't notice as every shift was a busy one for me. I soon learned what they meant. Many of the patients were restless or anxious, some even deciding to leave their rooms and walk around the floor. This became quite a hassle when we had to bring them all back to their rooms to give them medication and tell them that they needed to rest. I was pretty deep into my 12-hour shift, and as I finally got everyone settled, I was then told to go for a quick break. Nurses spent countless hours on their feet, so I jumped at the chance immediately. As I was walking down the hall to the break room, I noticed a senior patient at the other end of the hall, facing away from me. I then called out to him, but didn't get a response as he slowly turned the corner. This was more common with senior patients than you might think, so I decided to follow him and see where he was going. But as I turned the corner, I saw nothing. No one was there. I checked all the rooms in that hall, but he wasn't there. I don't know if it was because I was exhausted from running around that night, but perhaps I really did see a ghost of an old patient. I guess I'll never know. I live in a small town in a quiet neighborhood, and these stories are once told to me by my mom that I either didn't witness or didn't remember, that seemed to follow my mom's family from house to house while she was a teen. First story. My mom was laying in her bed when she got that horrible feeling. Most of you have probably felt it before. The absolute feeling of dread, as if something evil is near you. She lay in her bed in the dark at around midnight while she was feeling this, when she sat up and started looking around. Suddenly, she felt a pressure on the bed, as if somebody sat on it, and at the same time, she saw an imprint from the pressure going to one point at the end of the bed, as if an invisible being had sat on the end of the bed. She screamed, and her mom came running in, my Nana. She decided to lay with her for the rest of the night, and claimed to feel the horrible feeling as well. My mom started sleeping with a Bible, and wasn't troubled again. My mom's bedroom was in the basement. Story 2. My mom was about 16, and her friend was spending the night at her house. They were both asleep when they both woke up screaming at the same time. They had no idea why. They were in her bedroom in the basement. Years later, my dad was staying in the basement with a cousin who was visiting, and they both woke up at the same time screaming as well. They had no idea why. Story 3. My mom's 26 and I'm about 3 years old. She was spending the night at her parents' place to dog sit and decided to bring me. When we were in the basement, while she brushed her teeth in the bathroom, she said that 3-year-old me was talking to the door. She humored me and asked who I was talking to, and I responded, "The blue man." She humored me further and asked me again what I was talking about, and then I said, "He told me to call him Master." She picked me up and ran from the house screaming, leaving all of her belongings, which my dad retrieved the next day. Story 4. I was around 6 when this happened. I was playing games on my grandparents' computer in their basement by myself. That was the first time I ever felt that horrible feeling. The room in their basement, where the computer was my mom's old bedroom. I froze in place and didn't move for minutes when I finally sprinted upstairs and asked if I could be taken home. That was how scared I got. Fast forward and I'm 13, which is a few years ago. Sometimes it still happens, But if I think about these stories even briefly, I will see a black shadow man staring at me around the corners, or even in the middle of a room, only to disappear a second later. I think whatever horror infected my grandparents' house latched onto me when I was 6, and I brought it back home with me. My only hope is, now that I've relived this all, I hope I don't get a visit tonight. Afterthought. My room is in the basement of my house.
I stopped taking taxis about a year ago. I was 23 at the time and working as a community nurse. It was during the Christmas season, and my coworkers kept on pestering me to attend one of the yearly parties at the time. I can't say I was particularly excited. I've never really enjoyed heading out to bars, especially since I've always lived so far away. Getting home was always a stressful experience. But my partner at the time lived in the neighboring city, and he encouraged me to give it a go. Getting to know my coworkers outside of a hectic day in the healthcare system was certainly tempting. He finalized my decision by telling me he'd pay for the taxi to get home. I insisted he shouldn't, but I appreciated it. So the day I got the heels on, attended the party, and had a good time. After staying at the local we rented, my coworkers asked if I wanted to join them at a bar. I was hesitant, but confident that I would get home safe. Safety has always been a really important thing for me, and I've always been taught to take care of myself and to make reasonable decisions. At the time of the night, I've had some drinks. I'm not intoxicated, but I've enjoyed the night with my coworkers. One of my coworkers suggests heading to her place for the night and try to build a relation. I decided to go. We take the taxi and everything is fine. When I arrive at my coworker's place, however, I rethink my decision. It wasn't anything particularly wrong. I just kind of figured it would be nice to head home to my partner, so I wouldn't have to think about the travel the next day. So I tell her she won't need to stress about setting up a room for me and everything. I head back out again and call some random taxi company. I waited for a bit before I noticed a taxi driving up the sidewalk. I make the terrible decision to sit on the front seat. The man appears to not be from Norway. He's got stubble, dark hair, and dark skin. I remember he spoke with a heavy accent. The conversation starts normal. He asks where I've been and if I've enjoyed myself. After a moment, he asked if I'm Norwegian. I've got brown eyes, dark hair, and slightly tanned skin. It wasn't hard to figure, so I said no. But I was raised in Norway and considered myself to be Norwegian. It was after that the conversation started turning darker. He began talking about the Norwegian drinking culture and how women have behaved recklessly. He began referring women as whores and how they would carelessly have sex with men, regardless of their marriage and dignity. I kind of went along with the conversation. Insulting the guy was the last thing I wanted to do. A terrifying feeling of control overwhelmed me. While I wasn't intoxicated, I really didn't want him to have any suspicion that I wasn't in control of the situation. The longer the car ride continued, the more personal it got. "Where are you going?" "To my partner." "How long have you two been together?" "About a year." "Do you have sex often?" This question caught me off guard, and I kind of shrugged it off. I mumbled, "I don't really talk about that." And a mild silence overwhelmed the car. A traffic light turned red at some point during the ride, and he asked me to turn to him and come a little closer. I'm not really sure what to do at that point, but I turned to him, in which he looked into my eyes and told me that I had beautiful eyes. It was at this point that the alarms completely went off, and I was completely convinced that I was in danger. That was the moment when I slowly began to undo my heels, while the car was still in motion. I was ready to jump out of the car if I had to. It's only when I recognized the street that I managed to calm myself down, that he was, at the very least, taking me to my destination. When he finally pulls up to my partner's driveway, is when I quickly pay. My heels are already in my hand, and he doesn't get a second to finish his sentence before I bolt out of the car barefoot into the house frantically. My partner wakes up and asks me what happened. The next day, I spend an entire day contemplating if I should call the taxi company and complain. I question myself repeatedly, but then I remembered that he called me at some point of the night to ask for a specific location, and the fear of him connecting the dots that it was me that complained about him catches me. I really regret that I never called in. I remember vividly looking down at my skirt, my heels, and then my top when he was talking about women in such a degrading way, and for a moment, I almost convinced myself that I was precisely what he was talking about. I wonder what would have happened if I had been more intoxicated, if I had less control of the situation, or if I wasn't heading to my partner. A lot could have gone wrong that night. I vividly remember reading in the newspaper 3 weeks later that there had been a taxi incident where a woman had been assaulted by a taxi driver. A month prior, my friend had nearly been dragged into a taxi because the taxi driver was begging her to have sex with him. All I'm saying is stay safe out there, girls. Always have a plan to get home. Hey, this event happened to me around last summer. It was probably the scariest story of my life, and I wanted to share it so hopefully someone learns from it. Something I've realized growing up, year by year, is that this world can be an amazing place, but it is filled with some super sick people. And unfortunately, I've seen that side of the world firsthand. I'm a very social person, and love the opportunity to hang out with friends whenever. I'm also the type of person who's always looking for the next big thing. I guess I should tell you, I was an 18-year-old male at the time of the story, and have a decent-sized friend group of both boys and girls. Throughout high school, we had done a lot of crazy shit together. Being just out of high school, we wanted to do something insane together before departing for college, and we all decided to go camping in the middle of nowhere for 3 days. Fun, right? And for some miracle, all our parents thought it'd be fine. So we had 6 people going. Me and my girlfriend, Stephanie, my friend Brandon, and his girlfriend Kaylee, and Steven and his girlfriend Sarah. We had decided to have 3 different tents for each group, for reasons you could probably guess. Being a former Boy Scout, I was aware of everything we needed to survive for 3 days: food, water, and other essential supplies. Being rebellious teenagers, we also stocked up on plenty of booze and weed for a fun getaway. So, mid-July, we depart for a camping vacation. After hours of driving and driving down back roads, we eventually find a place that looks secluded, but not too sketchy like some horror stories. There were houses nearby, but not too close. Again, we weren't looking for a sketchy woods to camp, but unfortunately no service. I took at least an hour for everything to get set up. While the girls and Steve finished setting up the camp, Brandon and I took a look around while fetching firewood. We eventually came across a cool-looking trail. We weren't too concerned, because there were houses within a mile radius, and we assumed that those people had used the trail to hunt, which was big in this area, or animals used it. If you're wondering about our car, we drove a Honda Pilot, which was Steve's, that had plenty of room for us and our supplies. We parked the car rather close to the site, so we had eyes on the car at all times. The first night, nothing much happened. We rolled a blunt and drank a bit, and called it a night. The next day, we decided to explore the woods a bit, but Brandon and Kaylee stayed behind to watch the site and spend time together. We decided to go down a path we found earlier. Around 20 minutes down the path, Steve spots a metal fence. We approach it to find a cemetery. The cemetery looked old, but there were signs of activity there. And no, not some voodoo shit or cult, like flowers and notes left. And beyond the cemetery, we saw a bigger trail that had tire tracks and half-assed parking lot for the cemetery. We ventured down the path a bit more, to spot some deer, then head back because it was getting late. That night, we really partied hard because we were about to leave the next day and didn't want to return with extra beer or weed. Now, this night was the polar opposite of the other night. The other night was peaceful, and we assumed the same about this night. As we began to turn in, boy, were we fucking wrong. Now, you would assume there would have been warning signs early in our trip, like a rusty knife on the path or foot tracks around our side. No, not at all. All of us woke to a blood-curdling scream coming from Steve and Sarah's tent, as we heard the fabric being ripped. What we assumed was something sharp. I guess Steve hit the guy really hard with the flashlight and was able to get both him and Sarah to his car. Now here's the issue. Steve's tent is the closest to the car, while the other two tents are closer to the trail. So, to get to Steve's car, we had to get past whatever attacked Steve and Sarah. Luckily, all our drunken selves were gone because before getting into the car, he yelled cemetery, and it clicked in my head. The trail on the other side of the cemetery. So I quickly grabbed Brandon, Kaylee, and Stephanie, and started running towards the trail. I used my phone flashlight to help see. You might think, why would you turn the flashlight on? Well, last thing I wanted to do was miss the cemetery and be lost in the woods, with the guy who attacked Steve. By the time we get to the trail, Steve and Sarah had gotten the fuck out from the site, and we could hear the guy chasing us, but from several yards behind. We were able to find the cemetery rather easily, and I hopped over the fence first. When we get over the fence, we noticed Steve had not arrived yet, so we all hid in the cemetery. Luckily to our advantage, it was pitch black by the time I had turned the flashlight off, and we all hid in a complete silence. My heart stopped when I heard the metallic shaking, as if someone was climbing over the fence. The guy had tracked us down, probably due to the fact that Steve yelled, "Cemetery!" We all stayed still as we heard the ground crunch, as the guy took slow steps. When in fight or flight moments, you are capable of a lot more than you think, and your brain is put in some super high alert mode, or some shit. As the guy approached, I realized I had a small Swiss Army pocket knife in my pocket, as the guy's steps grew closer to me. When he was right about on top of me, I grabbed the knife and lodged it into the back of his knee. The guy tumbled to the ground, with a shriek of pain and the metallic sound as he dropped his weapon. Soon the pair of headlights came around the corner. Steve had made it. We all got up and ran towards the car. While I got up, the light gave me a glimpse of the guy. He was tall, bulky, and had the look of pure hatred in his eyes as he clutched the back of his knee, and by his side, a huge machete. I was the last one to get to the car, and even before I fully closed the door, Steve flirted out of there. The girls were bawling their eyes out. We drove until the first house, where we politely knocked and asked for directions to a motel or something. It was a friendly old couple. They told us there had not been one for miles. They took us in and gave us warm food and a place to rest for the remainder of the night. In the morning, the man brought his hunting rifle with us to retrieve our stuff from the campsite. When we got there was nothing stolen, but all our tents were slashed up. The elderly woman called and made a report while we were gone, and when we got back, the officers were at their home, and we gave our statements. The officer said that there's not enough evidence to find the guy, but he promised a search. We headed home later that day. No one said a word on the way home. We were all processing what had really happened. The police unfortunately never found the guy. Yeah, college split us up a bit, but we barely talk about it as a group. It's been a year. My advice to all of you is please find a populated place to camp. I don't care if it's some Yogi Bear camp. Be in reach of help and the police. Stay safe, guys. Please. I met my stalker once last year, and would rather never do it again. She is an NYU student who doubles as a hacker. In the face of a network of hackers, think Elliot Anderson's crew on Mr. Robot, if all they wanted to do was make good people kill themselves. No joke. Just contacted the FBI about them today. I just can't really take it anymore. I mean, I can. The hackers run a sophisticated enough shadow network, probably 4chan based, and keep trying to get me to kill myself through a brutal, systematic, unending attack on me through any and all ways. I use the internet. Yes, they are here on Reddit too. I thought I was losing it for a while. So many moments where I felt like I was in a movie, the game. All the phone messages, emails, voicemails, personal details, and shadowy masked voices. I run a tight ship with my tech. Certainly now, after a few escalated years of this shit. I should have contacted law enforcement sooner, but I always just figured I was tough, and they were a bunch of kids. Bad by me. If anyone ever notices an unending stream of almost the same faced users, though race may change, contacting them on Tinder or OkCupid, that is these bitches. If anyone feels like they are connecting to the same users over and over on chat sites like Omegle, Free Chat Now, and all of that, them again. They love hacking these sites and bragging about it, or just showing off. It all started with me meeting a random chick on Omegle, I believe back in 2017, the one this all seemed to spin around. We became text friends, then she ghosted me, then she pretended to die of cancer, very convincingly, like well done Photoshop pictures of her in the hospital, medical facts nailed. I was very naive back then. Eventually, she came back to life and started contacting me again under different identities. I was able to tell it was her. I was stupid and kept playing the game. I hate to lose, and I like my internet freedom. Now, here I am 3 years later. I have gotten phone calls most days since from this group. They have sent me death threats, repeatedly tried to isolate me, through such acts as deleting all my new messages received on a dating app. Literally, they just would all disappear. No likes, nothing, as if they were not happening. I tried to kill myself last winter a few times, and then decided to leave New York. So I'm staying in Boston now. Obviously, everyone has it rough with the corona pandemic. I'm just really fucking happy I never have to meet the stalker person again. I hope I never do. I'm an Irish female, and this happened back in 2007, when I was in my mid-20s. Back then I loved going to clubs and dancing the night away. One particular night, I went out with some friends, which included my cousin Frank. We went to a nightclub, had some drinks, and danced to Daft Punk's One More Time, as well as other popular music at the time. I wasn't living in this town at the time, so I arranged to stay at Frank's house. We had the fridge stocked with beer for when we got back and planned on getting wasted. We probably left the club at around 1 a.m. and got a taxi to his house. Back at Frank's house, we spent a few hours listening to Led Zeppelin, Nirvana with a bit of Metallica thrown in for good measure. My cousin was in a rock band and loved the classics. At around 3 a.m., Frank's bandmate, Jack, called and asked if we could come over and stay. He had been clubbing at a different location and needed somewhere to crash. Frank lived alone in a 3-bedroom house, and being a single guy, he hosted a few wild parties over the years. Frank told him no problem. He can come over, but explained we were having a quiet night. In other words, not to bring anyone else. Jack came over and seemed super friendly. Being the drummer of the band, he looked exactly like what I expected. Long hair, Zeppelin t-shirt, and ripped jeans. His behavior changed not long after arriving. He was super animated, and I don't know, just on a different buzz. He seemed drugged on something, and hey, as long as he enjoys himself, who am I to judge? At one stage, he started playing air drums, and continued with that for ages. During one of the air drum solos, I asked him something, and he didn't answer. I kinda nudged him, very lightly, But just to get his attention, Jack went crazy and started shouting at me to never interrupt him when he was playing drums. Drums? Sorry, did he really think he was playing real ones? Anyway, this pissed me off. I didn't like the aggression. Frank said, Relax, man. There's no need to shout. Jack replied, No one should interrupt me when I'm in the zone, man. No one. Me and Frank eye-rolled and carried on chatting, drinking, and ignoring him. The atmosphere changed after that, and after a short time, I went to bed. I don't know how long after, but I was awoken from a deep sleep. I heard this breathing sound in my room. Still in a drunken slumber, it took me a few minutes to register that the noise sounded like someone inhaling. Someone was in my bed, with a bunch of my hair in his hand sniffing it. I froze, then said, What the fuck are you doing? Jack replied, Relax. I'm just smelling your hair. I'm not gonna do anything. Well, adrenaline coursed through me, but I was stuck to the bed with fear, and the room was pitch black. I shouted, Frank! At the top of my voice. And in speedy time, he ran in the room, turned on the light, only to find Jack in my bed, holding a handful of my hair. He said, It's not what it looks like, bud. I was only smelling it. I was sleeping facing the door, so could see Frank. I dared not to look behind me to see Jack, but his voice sounded like that of a child that knows he's done something wrong and is about to get in trouble. Frank lost it, told him to get the fuck downstairs. My cousin apologized and said he did not want to kick him out of the house in the drugged up state he was in. The door had no lock, so my cousin slept in a chair in front of my bedroom door. Jack actually tried to come in again. I woke to Frank telling him to get the hell back downstairs, or he's going to kick him out of the house. Jack retreated once again. The next day he was gone by the time I woke up. But a few days later, when Frank tracked Jack down, he was told he'd been mixing drugs with alcohol and was embarrassed by his behavior. Even though it's been years since it happened, it still gives me the creeps when I think about it. Those sniffing sounds, big, deep, slow inhales, still give me goosebumps. The man broke up not long after that, so I never had to meet him again. I was told he was a good guy, so he may have been on drugs that made him super strange. I'm just glad Frank was there, or who knows how I would have got him out of my room. When I was 9, I went back to my home country for a vacation. My mom and I stayed at my aunt's place, as it was great fun always. My cousin's brother, Lorenzo, had an English tutor, Charlie. Lorenzo would tell me Charlie is coming over, and he'd get amazed with my English speaking. Once Lorenzo was done with his tutoring, he went into the kitchen to join my aunt and mom. He told me not to be rude and say hi to Charlie. I went near the doorway and muttered, "Hi." Charlie smiled at me and asked me to come in and check out one of the storybooks he got Lorenzo. I loved reading, so I agreed, sitting next to me. The next thing I knew, he just stared at me. He asked, why does my hair smell so good? He literally took a big whiff. He complimented on how cute the miniskirt looked on me. 9-year-old me didn't know any better. I was polite and thanked him. He asked if I wanted to go to his home for dinner, and he'd cook delicious food for me. Thank God for my aunt, who barged in and asked me to come into the kitchen for tea. Charlie left right after. My aunt and mom asked me what happened earlier, and they've both decided they didn't want Charlie in for tutoring the same moments I was in the house. 2 years ago, I went back for a visit and asked my aunt where Charlie went after all these years. She said he ran off to a foreign country because of an issue. So, creepy tutor, let's not meet again. This happened to me in 2016, but I was having trouble sleeping tonight, and my brain dredged this up from memories. I had recently moved back to my college town, so I can rent an apartment with a friend after a long-term relationship ended. I was doing a lot of job hunting for pretty much anything, as I was pretty desperate for income and unsuccessful with finding work within my career field. I was using multiple job sites, but mostly Indeed, because I like their website features that help you track which jobs you've applied for and their statuses. There were, of course, some jobs that I applied for on their own website, but I kept track. After a couple of weeks of searching, I get a call. I didn't recognize the number, and the area code wasn't familiar, but I picked it up as it might be a job prospect. A woman is on the other end, and she's saying that she's calling up to set up an interview, as I had applied for their company. The company's name was not something that I remembered applying for. While on the phone with her, I quickly pulled up Indeed on my laptop and looked up through all the jobs I had applied for. None matched. I have no idea what this job is, but don't make this apparent on the phone, as I've been job searching for weeks and am still unemployed. I ask her for the address of the building and write it down. Looking back, I can't remember the name she gave me, but what I do remember was how pushy she was into scheduling the interview for later that evening. I agreed to the interview and thanked her, but as I hung up, I got a very bad feeling. Something doesn't seem right. So I Googled the phone number, and it's not linked to a company. I Googled the address, and it's also not affiliated with a company. It's from a way outside the distance of jobs that I was applying for, almost an hour away from where I lived. I pull up Google Street View, and all I could see for the address she gave me was several smaller rundown buildings, with a highway exit in the distance. It looked desolate. I pictured myself driving there around dusk when she scheduled the interview, and I could physically feel the sensation of dread settle in me. I didn't want to go. I brought all this up to my roomie at the time. He said I might be overthinking it, but if I wasn't comfortable with it, not to go. I am so glad that I didn't go. The more time passed, the more I'm aware of just how shady it was. In hindsight, I wish that I had gone to the police, but I didn't at the time because the year prior, I hadn't had much faith in them. I had tried to get a restraining order before on an ex who was telling me to kill myself and harassing me from burner numbers. Who knows what could have happened if I had gone? It's a scary thought. I often go to bed early. As I reach 30, I'm trying to get into a routine at night. From a young age, I have always been able to control large aspects of my dreams. Flying, killing zombies, making people vanish, and swimming underwater. But this tends to come at a price. I suffer highly from sleep paralysis. I often can't move in my bed. I see shadows dart across the room. I feel heavy forces pushing against my chest. I once seen a man running around my bed, and with all my might, I jumped up and ran out of my bedroom to turn around and see no one. My fiancée Jamie has started sleeping on the couch. This is because I scream waking up in the night. The sheets are soaked with sweat and tears. I went to a medium who stated I may be a psychic myself. This made a lot of sense to me, as I saw my grandfather in a dream the night he died. I also saw my Nan in a similar dream after she passed. She warned me about testicular cancer. I'm fine, God forbid I ever get such an illness. But my friend, who I'll call Matt, found a lump. I told him about my dream. He got checked, got surgery, and is now recovering. Thanks, Nan. I'm even telling my partner things that he has never told me about his family. The clothes he was wearing the day he was taken from his mother, phrases his grand said in life, and so on. When I wake up at night, I started saying the Lord's Prayer when I feel a presence. It does a little help. I'm not religious, I just think that we're energy. This can't be destroyed. So, if you think of how much focus energy has on religion, there must be a combined force helping me through. If enough people focus on something, it becomes stronger, hence good and bad, heaven and hell, and so on. I sleep with the TV on now, so if I'm awoke at some point, I just convince myself that it's the influence of the TV in my dream. I'm often very tired. I feel more exhausted during the day than I do at night. This has affected my work life, as the doctors think I may have psychological or neurological condition. It's proven that we only use 10 to 20% of the power in our brain. So what if somehow I tapped into another part, a part that can sense things, predict things, and freak people out on a daily basis due to the fact that I'm always on point with analysis, psychology, etc. I find it very easy to make friends. Animal and children take to me very well. This part I love. I'm a kind-hearted man who believes in manners, etc. I live in Glasgow, so that's rare. If anyone out there could shed a little light on my situation, you take the good, you take the bad, and there you have the facts. Of Dan anyways, that's my story. That's why I can't often sleep at night. I fear what I might see. Back in 2015, I was working as a live-in home health aide for a wealthy family. It was just me and my patient living in a very nice condo, in a quiet neighborhood, on a golf course. We were the youngest people who lived there. I was 27 at the time. My patient was a 21-year-old male with Asperger's, SPD, and BPD, and some substance abuse problems. He had recently got into some trouble and been legally declared incompetent. We will call him Jake. Jake was a nice kid, but he had severe emotional issues and almost no social awareness, compounded by the refusal to take prescribed medication, which worked incredibly well when he took it, and drug abuse. He was taken advantage of a lot because of the crowd that he hung around with. Right before I moved in, 6 friends came to hang out with Jake one day and ended up staying for 2 weeks, draining Jake's bank account and various drugs, meth, coke, MDMA, weed, and absolutely trashing the condo. Jake was lonely, and he never said no to people. He wanted them to like him. Honestly, I think Jake was 14 to 15 years old mentally. I think he turned to drugs to deal with depression and anxiety, and also to fit in with the people around him. He's much better now. It was a sweet gig. I was paid very well, lived in a nice condo rent-free, and basically just had to keep our house clean, keep food in the fridge, and make sure he took his medication. When I moved in, my boss, Jake's mother, warned me about a girl who occasionally stayed with her father, who was our downstairs neighbor. She told me that the girl's name was Amber, and that she looked younger, but she was 37 years old, tall, blonde, and very thin. She was right. She looked much younger, like 25-ish. She said Amber didn't have a car or a job, and that she was an addict who liked to use Jake. Amber's father had custody of her 2 children, and she would come visit the kids and stay for a few days a week. She said one day, Amber asked to borrow Jake's car for an hour, and ended up running off with it for 2 weeks. Amber was also one who introduced Jake to 6 friends who trashed the condo. She was bad news and was never allowed in the condo. She wanted me to call her immediately if Amber stopped by, or Jake went anywhere with her. After the theft, she put a GPS on Jake's car, and allegedly she could stop the engine. My boss made it clear that she didn't expect me to be a security guard, just to notify her things that were going on leading up to this event. I had a few run-ins with this Amber, and where I had to politely tell her that things like she was not allowed to come into the apartment. Jake could not take her to the store or anywhere. No, Jake couldn't go to a party at her boyfriend's house, etc. Amber was always spaced out, like she talked slow and seemed wide-eyed and off. She explained to me that she had been hit by a car while riding her bike recently, and complained that she was the one who ended up going to jail. I was like, how? Apparently she takes a lot of Xanax and was under the influence, so I think that explains the spaced out part. Anyway, she was never aggressive, but it was clear that she didn't like me, and often would say things like, Jake is his own person. He's a 21-year-old man. He doesn't need permission. And whenever she spoke to Jake, when we saw her at the gym or in a parking lot, she would be whispering to him, no doubt trying to manipulate him into giving her money or something. Anyway, on the incident, Jake was out of the state with his father, giving me a mini vacation. My best friend was staying over to spend a few days with me, and we were drinking PBR and watching RuPaul's Drag Race. It was like 11 p.m., and we hear a light knock at the door. I go investigate through the peephole and see it's Amber. I ignore her. She knocks louder, and about 30 seconds later, I watch her leave through the peephole and sit back down, telling my friend the situation. 5 minutes go by, and she's back. This time she's pounding on the door like a cop. I'm getting pissed because I'm off work, and I don't want to deal with her crazy, especially when my friend is over. So I say nothing and go back to the couch. She knocks like a normal person and starts saying, "Hello, Jake? OP? I need some help. Hello?" I still don't answer. Then I hear her try to open the door. It's locked. Anyways, I'm a habitual door locker, and this enraged her or something, and she starts screaming and pounding on the door nonstop. I get up and look through the peephole again, and she looks like a demon. Her pupils were huge, and I think she was on something. She looked crazy. Her hair was tangled and wild, and she was sweating and angry. Looking back, I'll never forget those wide pupils looking at me through an evil glare. I asked her through the door what she wants, and she said she needs to speak with Jake right now. He owes her money, and she needs a ride to her boyfriend's house right now. I tell her Jake isn't home, and then she asks me if I will take her. I tell her no. I've been drinking and I'm going to bed. She let out a frustrated scream, punched the door, and left. My friend and I went to the bed shortly after. Didn't hear from her again after that. The next morning, we're getting ready to leave to go to breakfast. I hear a knock like a policeman's knock at the door. You know the sound. I look through the peephole expecting to see Amber, but this time, it's an actual cop. I open my door and see my parking lot is full of police. There's a van marked crime scene unit and an ambulance. I honestly assume Amber overdosed or something. The cop wants to speak to me if I heard anything strange last night. I tell him about my encounter with Amber and ask if she's okay. He tells me she's in custody for the murder of her father. Does Jake own a crossbow, and is it missing? Yes, and yes. It's been missing for weeks. He says I need to speak with some detectives at the station. So, I don't know if she came to my door before and after she murdered her father with a fucking crossbow, like she's Tyrion Lannister or something. But the detective told me that his theory was that she was a heroin addict, and she was on withdrawal and needed to get to her boyfriend's for more dope. She tried to get Jake to drive her, and when that didn't work, she asked her father, who refused. This is what went down. They argued. Other neighbors heard that. She killed him with a stolen crossbow and stole his truck. She only got a mile away before she was signaled to pull over. She led the cops in a high-speed chase over the span of 2 counties before she finally lost control and crashed. The cops were only pulling her over on suspicion of drinking and driving, but when they went to speak to her, she told them that she was speeding because she needed to check on her dad. She thinks someone stabbed him. They asked her why she thought that, and she wouldn't answer. They sent police for a welfare check, and they found him before her son did. So, that was the time my crazy drug addict neighbor murdered her father with my patient's crossbow. Let's never meet again. I really am at a loss for what happened here, but it all seemed too weird to me. Maybe it's not connected at all, or I was just being paranoid, but you decide. My boyfriend, 23, and I, 23 female, had to go to Atlanta this weekend, following social distancing. We weren't in the heart of the city, but a little outside of it. We'd been here many times before, and it's always been safe for us. We might have been a little too naive. We got to the hotel around 7 p.m. My boyfriend wanted to take a shower, so I said I would go to the McDonald's drive-thru. I went to the McDonald's by myself at 8 p.m. and was back at around 8:15. The hotel we're staying in was one next to the mall strip of restaurants and shops. The hotel we're staying in is one right next to a mall and strip of restaurants and shops, but somehow still is a little secluded. The front faces a big empty lot, and the back is a freight shipping place. It's a Meredith, by the way, just to give an idea of the place. When I was walking in, I noticed two guys in the empty parking lot across the street, with no car in sight. Weird, but I was already in the front of the store, so I wasn't nervous. We were just eating and watching TV, and around 10 p.m., I heard an alarm. I said to my boyfriend, "Someone must have gone out of the emergency exit," and he looked around and saw that it was our car alarm going off. The key was on the side table the whole time, so we didn't accidentally press it. He said he was going to turn off the alarm since it wasn't working through the window. I didn't think anything of this. Right when he left, I had an overwhelming feeling of dread and anxiety. It hit me like a train. I immediately got up and locked the deadbolt. I laughed at myself for doing this and saying I was paranoid. I then went to look out the window to check if he turned it off and was on his way up so I can get ready to unlock the deadbolt. When I looked out, I saw a guy in the empty parking lot, but only one now. I called my boyfriend and said, "Don't go outside. Just click it from the lobby. There's someone in the empty parking lot." He said I was paranoid, but he always goes along for my peace of mind. All of a sudden, I heard a light knock. I thought it was my boyfriend, but I'm not an idiot. I always look through the peephole, and I'm so glad I did. I looked through and my heart sank. It was a man staring straight through the peephole, like he was trying to look in. That alone could have given me a heart attack, especially because it's a fisheye, so it looked huge. He had a dark beard and a sweatshirt with a hood, either black or navy blue. Obviously, I was not opening the door. I wanted to call my boyfriend, but I didn't want the man to know I was in my room. I went into the bathroom, called my boyfriend, and whispered, "Someone's at the door. Please come back." The knock started getting louder and louder. He didn't say anything though. Maybe because it was late, or maybe he was drunk and had the wrong room. Then silence. I wanted to know if he was still there, but I dreaded the heart drop if I saw him in the damn fisheye peephole again. My legs were like lead walking over. To my surprise, he was gone. Not even 10 seconds later, frantic knocking that made my heart drop again. But then I heard my boyfriend's voice, and I didn't care if the guy came back. I wouldn't lock him out. I opened the door, and he said, right when he turned into the hallway, before he can even say anything, the man booked it down the fire exit. Maybe the two things weren't related at all, but it seemed way too weird and eerie to me. We told the front desk the next morning what had happened, but since it was all so odd and potentially not connected, we didn't call the cops or anything. We have left though, and are back home thankfully. Scary man in the fisheye peephole. Let's never meet.